Operating a camera within a church worship environment has so much creative freedom, but there are a few general guidelines and tips that I would like to give to help make you a better camera operator. So these next few tips are going to be some general guidelines, not really anything super specific and super strict that you need to follow, but hopefully they will give you some better idea of what kind of shots we're looking for when we're video directing and what kind of shots that's really going to draw the online audience into an engaging worship experience. Starting out with number one is always have a subject or a focus. So a lot of beginner operators will start to just kind of sweep the room, and sometimes even on a gimbal, they'll just kind of go down a line of people or even in the audience. It's a really common technique, and sometimes I'll find myself just really wanting to get a good shot of the room. So obviously that's not always bad, but as a general rule, I do like to try and have one focal point of the image. Now that can be a single vocalist, that can be the whole stage, that can be one person in the crowd, or even a single instrument. It really depends, but just knowing what your audience is going to be looking at is going to make a world of a difference whenever you're operating a camera and continue to draw your audience in. The second tip, or really loose guideline that I like to talk about, is always having a little bit of movement in your shot. So it's really easy to think that a really strong handheld shot or a really quick movement can be distracting, but I typically think that just having no movement whatsoever in the frame can either be equally or even more distracting. So having a little bit of movement in your shot, if you're on a tripod, that usually just means a slow zoom in, slow zoom out. If you're handheld, depending on the energy of the song, sometimes it does help to kind of move your hands back and forth just to get a little parallax movement in there. But you can also zoom in, rack focus. There's a lot of different options when you're handheld just to have some more movement in your frame and create a little more engaging experience. Now the last rule is definitely not a hard and fast rule in any way. It's kind of more of a guideline or even a tip for a little advanced camera switching. So something that I've found when I'm switching cameras is sometimes I really do like to go quicker, and if you have a smaller amount of cameras and the energy of the song is picking up, it can be a little difficult to be able to switch cameras faster, especially when your camera operators either aren't ready for the next shot or they're transitioning or they're moving on stage or down stage. Anything like that can kind of create some downtime in some of your camera operators' shots. So the last tip that I would have for camera operators would be always have some sort of usable shot. So even if they're transitioning, I find that even just kind of holding the camera up so that if the director or the switcher operator needs to cut to that camera, then they can. Sometimes that's all the director or the switcher operator needs to keep the pacing of the song going. So transitioning to the sermon or the speaking portion of an online service on Sunday, our camera one is our tight follow. That's just on a tripod at the back of the room and getting some zoom out, zoom in shots during worship. And then during the sermon, they're just doing a tight follow on our pastor as he moves across the stage. Now, as a guest speaker comes in or something changes, sometimes it is hard to find a balance between a tight follow and giving them a little bit of room, but generally I just like to say don't let them fall out of the screen for any reason, but give them a little room to maneuver, so don't keep them in the center of the screen. But it does take a little bit of predicting when the pastor is going to move, so sometimes that is hard to predict. But a general rule that I just like to say is don't let them go out of the screen, but give a little room to maneuver within it. After some of the more basic or generic tips that we talked about a little earlier, let's go through some more advanced shots that really help take your online experience to another level, especially when using some handheld cameras. So the first shot that I want to talk about is a rack focus. That really is just kind of transitioning your focus from one subject to another. So really all you need is a good subject in the foreground as well as another good subject in the background. I find kind of standing behind the keys player and then using the keys and then one of the worship leaders on the front of the stage, at least in our setting, works really well for this kind of shot. Generally, it's pretty safe to just do it with manual focus. So the switch on the side of most of our lenses just switches from autofocus to manual focus, and then you can use the ring on the front just to transition whenever the switcher operator calls you. But with some of our more hybrid or mirrorless cameras like our Sony a7 IIIs that are typically wireless on stage during worship, you can actually do this with autofocus. So you can actually tap the screen to transition from one focus point to another. So here's a good example of just doing a rack focus with manual focus as well as with autofocus. The next shot I want to talk about takes a lot of elements from a rack focus. So again, you can do this with autofocus or manual focus. Generally, manual is a little more highly regarded, especially in a live production setting when you don't typically want to rely on autofocus. But again, these cameras do really well for autofocus, so I wouldn't be totally against using them in a live production setting. But the next shot is called a whip pan. So essentially, you're just kind of moving the camera from one shot to the next, usually really quickly. Now, this is a shot that you really want to use in a faster pace song. It really doesn't fit very well when it's slow or there's kind of a lull or especially a transition between songs. There's definitely a time and a place. But once you know how to use this kind of shot, it looks really professional and can come across really well to online viewers. So here's an example of a whip pan with autofocus on. We'll just focus on one subject and then we'll just switch the camera over to another subject really quick, and you can see the energy of this song is really high. And then we'll just do the same thing with manual focus. It is a little bit slower, but still works really well. Aside from some basic and more advanced composition rules, there's a lot of other content online especially that covers that for photography and videography. But something else that I did want to cover is listening to the camera cues from the video switcher. So as I mentioned in the Worship Video Director video, typically what you're going to hear on a Sunday is ready camera 1, go camera 1, or just 1. Whenever your video director is switching between cameras. Usually when they preview up a camera, they'll say ready 1, and then whenever they switch that and go live with that camera, they'll say go 1. So just some good tips on that. One is to start your movement early. So whenever they say go camera 1, that is usually not the time to start a really slow movement to the side or something like that. Whip pans are obviously a little bit different because the movement kind of starts in the middle of the shot. But if you're doing a slow movement or you're doing a focus transition, something like that, similar, especially some slow zoom ins from a tripod camera at the back of the room, that really isn't the time to start your movement. Usually I like to start it when they say ready camera 1, or sometimes kind of right in the middle of those two cues. That way when they cut to you, your movement's already started and it allows for a really clean transition between shots. That's pretty much it for this video. I do have a few other videos on different elements or aspects of live production, but hopefully that just gave you some few extra tips on how to better operate your cameras and create a more engaging online worship experience.